Matthias, a black boy and homeless, left everyone speechless when he shouted at a millionaire inside one of the most luxurious restaurants not to eat his food, but no one knew what he had seen. The restaurant was a refuge for the elite. The constant buzz of refined conversations mixed with the clinking of silverware against porcelain, while waiters glided between tables carrying meticulously prepared dishes. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and herbs lingered in the air, completing the lavish atmosphere of the space. At the center of the hall, at a strategically positioned table, sat Ricardo Montenegro. At 72 years old, he exuded the confidence of a man who had built an empire from scratch. His impeccably tailored suit hugged his upright posture, and the gold-rimmed glasses reflected the sophistication of someone used to commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, nor rush for the world to turn in his favor. He was the type of man who made the rules. Across from him, Natalia, his wife, looked like she had stepped out of a magazine cover. Her face, shaped by the perfection of the most expensive cosmetics, displayed a cold and calculated beauty. Her black hair fell over her shoulders in meticulous waves, and the flawless red lipstick matched her well-manicured nails. Despite all the refinement, her gaze was not fixed on her husband. She scrolled her finger over her phone's screen, absorbed in a universe that didn't include Ricardo. Outside the large glass window, where the sidewalk met luxury, Matthias watched. He was just a skinny boy in worn clothes and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too large for his slim frame. His restless eyes darted from table to table, analyzing untouched plates, looking for a scrap, a moment of distraction that would allow him to move closer. He was used to being ignored, but that afternoon what he saw made him forget his hunger. Natalia lifted her eyes from the phone for a moment, checking if Ricardo was still distracted. He was reading messages on his phone, his glasses slightly lowered on the tip of his nose. It was then that her hand slid into her designer bag, her nimble fingers closing around a small vial. Matthias watched without blinking. The cap twisted off. Effortlessly and in a casual movement, Natalia leaned slightly over the table, pouring a clear liquid into Ricardo's steaming soup. The liquid mixed quickly with the broth, disappearing as if it had never existed. Matthias held his breath. For a moment, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the coldness in Natalia's gestures, the way she stirred the soup casually, with the spoon, as if she had done nothing wrong, made the boy's blood run cold. She leaned a little closer to Ricardo, her lips moving softly. Matthias didn't hear all the words, but he caught enough. "After all the work I've done, you're not going to ruin everything now." He felt his body freeze. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing like an alarm. His eyes shot to Ricardo's hand, now holding the spoon, about to bring it to his mouth. The hunger consuming Matthias disappeared. There was no more room for hesitation or doubts. Without thinking, he crossed the restaurant entrance, the sudden warmth of the luxurious environment contrasting with the cold outside. He ignored the suspicious glances and the initial shock of the customers, and with all the strength he found within himself shouted, "Don't eat that!" The scream cut through the air like a sharp blade. The restaurant, previously vibrant with lively conversations and the clinking of silverware, plunged into a suffocating silence. All eyes turned to the skinny, disheveled figure of Matthias, standing next to Ricardo Montenegro's table. The boy was panting, as if he had run for miles, his wide eyes fixed on the spoon hanging between the rich man's fingers. Ricardo froze mid-motion, the steaming soup hovering just in front of his face. He frowned, not quite understanding what was happening. His gaze shifted to Matthias, then to Natalia, who maintained an impassive expression, although her fingers were clenched into a firm fist on the table. "What did you say?" Natalia's voice was smooth, but there was a thread of tension, a hint of something dangerous like a cornered animal. Matthias took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He wanted to run, to disappear, but he had already spoken, and now there was no going back. "I saw." He pointed at the bowl in front of Ricardo. "She put something in your soup when you weren't looking." Murmurs began to ripple through the restaurant. Customers exchanged confused and curious glances. Waiters hesitated in the middle of the dining room, unsure if they should intervene. Some more discreetly took out their phones, ready to capture any scandal. Ricardo turned his gaze to Natalia, who let out a short laugh, a rehearsed laugh filled with forced disbelief. "This is absurd," she said, tossing her hair back with a calculated move. "This boy is clearly just trying to get attention." "Ricardo, don't listen to him." But something in her tone didn't convince her husband. Ricardo Montenegro had spent his life dealing with negotiators, liars, and opportunists. He could read people better than anyone, and at that moment, Natalia didn't just seem irritated by the boy's presence. She seemed nervous. He slowly lowered the spoon onto the table, his cold eyes studying his wife. "What is he saying, Natalia?" The woman blinked a few times, as if trying to compose herself. "Ricardo, seriously, this is ridiculous. Are you really going to believe a street kid? Look at him, he clearly just wants money." Matthias clenched his fists by his side. "I don't want anything. I just couldn't let you eat that." The weight of the words fell like thunder. A younger waiter, who had been closely observing the scene, cleared his throat before cautiously approaching. "Sir, if there's any doubt, I can take the soup to the kitchen and ask for it to be analyzed." Natalia turned abruptly to the employee, her gaze piercing. "You will not do any such thing. This is complete nonsense." But Ricardo no longer seemed inclined to accept her words as absolute truth. He picked up the spoon again and, instead of bringing it to his mouth, brought it to his nose, inhaling carefully. His face remained expressionless, but something in his gaze changed. "Call the manager and ask for someone from the kitchen to examine this." Natalia stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "Ricardo, are you really going to humiliate your wife like this in front of everyone?" All eyes were on her now, customers whispering, some discreetly recording. The image of the perfect, elegant wife was starting to crack. Matthias didn't back down. "If I were lying, you wouldn't be so desperate to stop them from testing the food." His voice didn't tremble. He could feel the sweat trickling down his neck, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't look away. Ricardo slowly leaned back in his chair, crossing his fingers on the table. He studied Natalia with calculated coldness, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "I trusted you, Natalia," he said, his voice low but firm. "But now I want to know the truth." The woman looked around, her face alternating between shock and fury. "This is an insult," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "Are you really going to choose to believe a filthy kid you don't even know over me?" But Ricardo didn't respond immediately. He just watched. Every detail, every tremor in her voice, every glance away, and that's when he realized. Natalia wasn't outraged because she had been falsely accused. She was outraged because she had been caught. The restaurant doors swung open, and 2 security personnel entered along with the manager. The tension in the room was thick as fog. Ricardo took a deep breath and with a gesture pointed to the bowl of soup. "I want this tested. Now." Natalia froze. For a second, just a second, she seemed to consider her options. Then, as if something within her had broken, her rigid posture gave way and a low, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You always thought you were so smart, didn't you, Ricardo?" The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. "What are you saying?" Ricardo asked, his voice turning into a whisper. Natalia looked up, now maskless, without artifice. Just cold and hollow. "I'm saying you should have eaten that damn soup." The silence that followed was absolute. The manager looked from one to the other before discreetly signaling to the security personnel. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you come with us." Talia let out a short laugh but couldn't resist. She simply grabbed her bag with a slow and elegant motion, as if she still had control of the situation. Matthias watched as the security guards escorted her out, her figure disappearing beyond the restaurant doors. He felt his body relax, the tension draining from his muscles, as if he just now realized how tight he had been. Ricardo continued staring at the soup in front of him, as if everything around him was distant. Then finally, he lifted his gaze to Matthias. The boy felt a knot tighten in his throat. "You," Ricardo began, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat, then tried again. "You saved me." Matthias simply nodded. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. Then Ricardo did something unexpected. He pulled the chair next to him, and without saying a word, motioned for Matthias to sit down. The boy hesitated. He had never sat in a restaurant like that. He had never been so close to a man like Ricardo Montenegro without being thrown out, but that day things felt different. Slowly, he pulled the chair out and sat down. And for the first time in a long while, Mateus felt like someone truly saw him. The silence between the two felt heavier than all the chatter that was now returning to the restaurant. Whispers spread among the patrons, furtive glances analyzed Ricardo and Mateus, as if trying to decipher what would happen next. But Ricardo didn't seem to care about the onlookers. His eyes were fixed on the skinny boy in front of him, who now sat in the opposite chair, tense, as if ready to flee at any moment. Matthias didn't know if he should say something. His hands were splayed on the table, and he could still feel the cold from the street on his skin. It wasn't a place he should be. It wasn't a chair he expected to sit in. Ricardo seemed to have noticed his discomfort, but instead of pressing him, he simply took a deep breath and raised his hand to call a waiter. "Bring 2 plates," he said, his voice firmer than he felt at that moment. "And something warm for him to drink." The waiter nodded without questioning. The restaurant was still in shock from the events, and no one seemed to want to contradict the man who had almost been poisoned by his own wife. Mateus swallowed hard. "I'm not hungry," he murmured, although his stomach insisted otherwise. Ricardo raised an eyebrow. "No need to lie to me, kid. You're skinny as a twig. Eat." The phrase was simple, but it didn't sound like an order. It was something closer to an invitation. Mateus didn't know how to respond, so he remained silent, watching the man in front of him. Ricardo took off his gold-rimmed glasses and slowly cleaned them with a napkin, a gesture that seemed more like a ritual to organize his own thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer. "You saved me." Mateus quickly looked up. It wasn't a question, nor a formal thank you. It was simply a statement, a harsh truth that still seemed difficult to process. "I saw what she did," Mateus said, his voice hesitant, as if he were waiting for Ricardo to change his mind and kick him out at any moment. "I couldn't let you eat." Ricardo fell silent for a moment, as if those words carried more weight than he expected. He rested his elbows on the table, fingers crossed before his face. "Why?" he finally asked. "You don't know me." "You have nothing to gain from this." Matthias blinked a few times, confused. He had never thought of it that way. He simply did what he thought was right. The problem was that no one had ever questioned him about something like this before. Life on the street had taught him to think fast, to act before someone noticed his presence, but not to respond to deep questions like that. "Because it was wrong," he finally answered. "And because no one else was watching." Ricardo studied the boy for a long moment, and Matthias held his gaze. There was no falseness there. There was no implicit request for reward, nor a tone of self-pity. It was just the simple truth from someone who knew what it was like to be ignored. The waiter returned, serving 2 plates of hot food and a cup of steaming hot chocolate for Mateus. The smell invaded his nostrils, and he felt his stomach churn with hunger. He looked at Ricardo, waiting for some instruction, but the man simply gestured for him to eat. The first few minutes were silent. Matthias held the utensils stiffly, used to eating quickly to avoid being chased away. But Ricardo just cut small pieces of his own food, watching him as if trying to understand something. "How long have you been living on the street?" he asked. After a while, Matthias hesitated. "A while," he replied without elaborating. Ricardo nodded as if he had anticipated a vague answer. "And where is your family?" Matthias dropped his fork. "I don't have one." The simplicity of the answer struck Ricardo in a strange way. He had heard stories like that before, of course. In his business, he knew many people were born without opportunities, homes, or chances. But hearing it directly from the mouth of a boy who had just saved his life made everything feel more real. He took a sip of water before speaking again. "Where do you sleep?" Matthias shrugged. "Wherever I can. Some nights in shelters, others on the street. It depends on the day." Ricardo didn't respond immediately. The silence between them lingered, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Matthias continued eating, his eyes discreetly attentive to any change on the man's face in front of him. I want to help, Ricardo finally said. Mateus looked up, suspicious. I didn't do it for money, he quickly said. I don't want anything in return. Ricardo smiled slightly. I know you don't. And that's exactly why I want to help. Mateus looked away. He wanted to believe those words, but he had heard promises before. Empty promises from people who wanted to feel better for a moment before going back to their comfortable lives. But Ricardo didn't seem like one of those. Still, the distrust was ingrained in his bones. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice almost challenging. Ricardo let out a soft nasal laugh as if the boy's response amused him. Nothing, he replied. But I think you deserve more than just running away, Mateus. The boy blinked upon hearing his name. Ricardo had called him by his name, and that made something inside him waver. I can get you a place to stay tonight, Ricardo continued, and if you accept, I can offer you something more. Mateus frowned. More? Ricardo leaned slightly forward. You saved me. Now I want to see if I can change your life like you changed mine. Mateus didn't know what to respond. The words were too big, and he felt that if he said yes, something in his life could change forever. He looked at the plate, at his hands, at the street outside the restaurant, and then back at Ricardo. He didn't know if he should trust that man, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe it was possible. So, hesitantly, he nodded. Mateus still didn't know exactly what he was getting into. Ricardo's proposal sounded surreal, almost unreal. People like him didn't help people like Mateus, at least not without expecting something in return, but there was something about that man's demeanor that made him hesitate before refusing. Maybe it was the tired look in his eyes, maybe it was the fact that he really seemed to be serious. After they finished their meal, Ricardo paid the bill and stood up, gesturing for Mateus to follow him. The boy hesitated for a moment, his instinct screaming for him not to trust so quickly, but at the same time his curiosity prevented him from simply running away. He followed him, the customers' gazes still glued to their backs, each trying to understand what a millionaire and a street kid could possibly have in common. As they exited the restaurant, Mateus felt the cold air hit his face, a reminder that until recently this was his only reality. Ricardo, for his part, took out his phone and made a quick call. Mateus only heard snippets of the conversation, words like boy, safe, and help, but he couldn't catch it all. When Ricardo hung up, he looked directly at him. A friend of mine runs a shelter for young people who need a fresh start. He already knows you're going there tonight. His voice was firm but not imposing. Mateus crossed his arms, his body tense. I've been in shelters before, he said, a hint of distrust in his tone. Most of them are no different from the street. Ricardo let out a sigh, nodding. I know many aren't good, but this one is, and you don't have to. Stay if you don't want to. But for today it's a warm, safe place with food. Later we can talk about what comes next. The boy frowned. Next? He wasn't thinking about next. He lived in the now. What he would eat today, where he would sleep today, how to avoid trouble today. But for some reason the idea that there could be a next started to seep into his mind. Okay, he finally said, but just for tonight. Ricardo didn't argue. He simply waved at a black car that was already waiting by the curb. The driver opened the door for Mateus, who hesitated for a moment before getting in. The interior was spacious, too comfortable, different from anything he had ever experienced. He curled up in the seat, feeling out of place as Ricardo got in beside him. The ride to the shelter was silent. Mateus looked out the window, watching the streets he knew so well fly by too quickly. When the car finally stopped, he saw a discreet but well-kept building, with lights still on despite the late hour. Ricardo got out first and waited for Mateus to do the same. The boy looked at the door, at the small sign, and then at Ricardo. What happens now? Now you have a choice, the man replied calmly. You can go in, rest, and decide tomorrow what you want to do with your life, or you can turn your back and keep running. Mateus bit his lip, looking at the building. He had made so many hard choices before, choices that always led him to survival. never to anything beyond it. But at that moment, standing next to a man he didn't even know if he could trust, something inside him wanted to believe. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the steps and entered. The reception area was simple but welcoming. A tall man with graying hair and glasses stood up from behind the desk and broke into a warm smile. "Matthias? Welcome." He extended his hand. "My name is Jonas. You can stay here as long as you need." The boy shook the man's hand hesitantly, his skin still cold from the night outside. I don't know if I want to stay." Jonas nodded, not seeming offended. "You don't need to decide anything right now. Just come in and see the place. Eat something. If you want to leave tomorrow, no one will stop you." Matthias looked at Ricardo, hoping for some reaction. But the businessman merely watched, not pressuring him. "I'll be back tomorrow," Ricardo finally said. "But whatever your decision, I want you to know you don't have to face this alone." The boy didn't know how to respond. He just nodded, and with one last look, Ricardo turned and left, leaving Matthias standing there, caught between the past and a future he could not yet see. That night, as he lay down on a clean mattress for the first time in years, Matthias didn't fall asleep right away. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of the shelter, feeling the weight of something new. He was used to loneliness, to abandonment, but now there was something different. For the first time in a long while, someone had given him a choice, and that in itself was frightening. Matthias didn't sleep that night. The mattress was comfortable more than any place he had ever slept before, but his body still wasn't accustomed to the idea of safety. The shelter was quiet, except for the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway and the low snoring of some boys in the other rooms. He rolled on the bed looking at the ceiling, his mind spinning non-stop. He could simply leave when the sun rose. He would grab his things, follow the streets he knew so well, and disappear, just like he always did. But then his mind went back to Ricardo, to the way he looked into his eyes, to how he didn't question his truth, didn't treat him like just some kid asking for change. Matthias couldn't explain it, but he felt that something was about to change. When dawn tinged the windows with orange hues, he finally got up. The hot water from the shower burned his cold skin, a luxury he had almost forgotten how it felt. The clothes Jonas, the shelter manager, handed him were clean and smelled of soap. It felt strange, like he was wearing something that didn't belong to him. In the dining hall, the other boys were having breakfast. Matthias took a bread roll and a cup of warm milk and sat down alone, unsure of how to act. He was still accustomed to eating quickly, glancing over his shoulder, ready to run. But here no one seemed hurried. No one appeared to fear being thrown out. When he finished, Jonas appeared by his side, lightly leaning on the table. "Did you sleep well?" Matthias shrugged, not wanting to commit. "Better than the cold floor," he replied. Jonas smiled, not looking surprised by the answer. "Ricardo called a few minutes ago," he said. "Said he would come pick you up." Matthias shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. He already knew Ricardo would come back, but hearing it out loud made it seem more real. He could just leave through the door now. Disappear before the man had a chance to try anything. "I don't know if I want that," he murmured, almost to himself. Jonas pulled out a chair and sat next to him, his gaze understanding but lacking pity. "It's okay. You don't have to decide anything right now, but can I give you some advice?" Matthias hesitated, then nodded slowly. "People like Ricardo don't show up every day, and when they do, we try to figure out what the catch is, what the trick could be. But sometimes, there's no trick at all. There's just someone who sees something in you that even you can't see." The boy fell silent, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "So, should I trust him?" he finally asked. Jonas took a deep breath before answering. I think you should trust yourself, in what you feel. But fear can't be the only thing deciding for you." Matthias didn't respond, but those words stuck in his mind as he waited. When Ricardo arrived, he was impeccably dressed as always, but his posture seemed less rigid. There was something different in his expression, a certain relief at seeing Matthias there, waiting. The boy crossed his arms, trying to appear indifferent. "You actually came," he said, not hiding his surprise. Ricardo gave a small smile. I said I would come back. Matthias looked at Jonas, then back at Ricardo. And now? The man shoved his hands into the pockets of his coat and tilted his head slightly. Now you come with me. Not to force you into anything, but to show you that there are other possibilities. After that, the choice is yours. The boy hesitated. There was still that part inside him screaming to run, but he ignored that instinct, took a deep breath and nodded. The car ride was silent. Matthias watched the city pass by the window, his eyes catching every detail, every street he knew too. Well, but then they started entering areas he had never explored, places that weren't part of his world. The car stopped in front of a modern but understated building. It wasn't a commercial building or a luxury hotel. It was something different. "Where are we?" he asked. Ricardo opened the door and got out first, waiting for Matthias to follow. "Come see for yourself." The boy got out of the car, looking around cautiously. The building was surrounded by a well-kept garden, and upon entering, he was greeted by a receptionist who nodded respectfully at Ricardo. "What is this place?" Matthias asked. Ricardo smiled slightly before responding. "A vocational training center. Young people who haven't had opportunities come here to learn skills, develop talents, and find a path. And I think you can find yours here." Matthias blinked, confused. "You want me to study here?" "I want you to have a choice," Ricardo replied. "You've spent too much time running. Now I want you to see what you can build." Matthias didn't know what to say. He looked around, watching other young people in glass rooms learning to use computers, studying projects, working in workshops. He felt something he didn't immediately recognize, something new, something scary. Hope. He took a deep breath. "And what if I'm not good at this?" Ricardo gave a faint smile. "You'll never know if you don't try." The boy looked one last time at the door behind him, at the path he came from, at the life he knew. And then he took the first step into the unknown. Matthias entered the building with hesitant steps, his eyes scanning every detail as if he were about to discover that it was a trap. The walls were made of glass, and through them he saw young people sitting and in front of computers, others in mechanic workshops, some talking to instructors who genuinely seemed to care about what they had to say. Ricardo walked silently beside him, allowing him to absorb everything at his own pace. The boy had never been in a place like that. He had never had the chance to study anything, to learn something that could give him a future. Until that moment, the future had always been just the next day, surviving the cold, finding the next shelter, the next meal. They stopped in front of a room where a small group was attending a class on graphic design. An instructor was showing something on the screen, and the students were typing quickly, focused. Matthias frowned. "What exactly do you want me to do here?" Ricardo crossed his arms and looked at him patiently. "I want you to choose something. Anything. Something that interests you. You can learn computer science, mechanics, cooking, design, or even entrepreneurship. You can build something of your own." Matthias chuckled softly, but there was no humor in his expression. "You talk as if it were easy." "And it's not," Ricardo admitted. "But I saw you risk your own safety to save a stranger's life. I saw courage there, and someone with that courage can learn anything if they get the chance." Matthias looked away, uncertain. Everything seemed too good to be true. "What if I don't like it?" he asked, still skeptical. "Then you follow another path, but at least you will have tried." The boy pressed his lips together and took a deep breath. His instinct told him to refuse, to run away, to not get tied to promises that could crumble. But a part of him, a small but insistent part, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have a place there. "All right," he finally said. I can try." Ricardo nodded, satisfied, and took Matthias to Jonas, who was already waiting for him in one of the administrative rooms. The tall man, wearing reading glasses, greeted the boy with a gentle smile. "I'm glad you came back." Matthias didn't know how to respond to that. He just nodded. "He will need an adjustment period, of course," Jonas said, looking at Ricardo. "But I'm sure he will fit in well here." Ricardo observed Matthias for a moment, then placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've already taken the hardest step. The rest is just a matter of time." The following days were a mix of novelty and discomfort. Matthias felt like he didn't belong in that place, yet at the same time, he didn't want to leave it. In the first days, he barely spoke to the other. Students just watched, analyzed, waiting to find out if this was really for him. But gradually, he started to adapt. He chose to begin learning computer science. At first, he just timidly typed on the keyboard, listening to the instructions without much enthusiasm. But then, something began to change. He liked the logic of things, the way he could create something from it. Zero, how lines of code could bring something to life that didn't exist before. For the first time, he found himself focused on something beyond mere survival. Ricardo watched his progress from afar. He didn't push, didn't ask too many questions. He only showed up from time to check on how the boy was doing. "You're different," he said one day after finding Matthias engrossed in a project. The boy looked at him, confused. "Different how?" "Like someone who is starting to see a future." Matthias didn't know what to say. He had never thought about the future before, but now the idea didn't seem so impossible. Months went by, and he continued learning. He formed bonds with some peers and began to feel less like an outsider. He still slept at the shelter, but he no longer saw himself as someone without a path. Then one day, Ricardo showed up with an envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing him a paper. Matthias furrowed his brow before opening it. His eyes scanned the words slowly, and then he looked up in disbelief. "This is a contract?" "For an internship," Ricardo confirmed. "I have a tech company that needs someone with your skills." Matthias blinked a few times, trying to understand. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity. Do you accept it?" The boy held the paper tightly. He didn't know how his life had changed so much in such a short time, but now he knew he could choose. "Yes," he replied firmly. Ricardo smiled. Then, "Welcome to your new beginning." And at that moment, Matthias realized that for the first time in his life he had a future, and he was ready to live it.